Well, it's a full house today. So hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our book talk series. I'm Joanne Zhang. I'm the Assistant Research Officer of the Philip K. Chuang Center for Chinese Law. I'm really excited to be moderating this hugely popular event, and I'm sure it will be fun and insightful for all of us. So sitting on the left side of me is our speaker today. Speak. Yeah, I am. Yes, I am. Is our speaker today, Angela Zhang, who is also the director of our center, of our Chinese Law Center. So Angela is a well-acclaimed leading authority on Chinese tech regulation, and she has written extensively on this topic. Her first book, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulation, came out in 2021 and was named one of the best political economic books of the year by ProMarket. And today we'll be talking about her second book, High Wire, how China regulates big tech and governs its economy. It was just released last week, and it's already a huge hit. It's so popular that it sold out on Amazon, right? But it's not available again on Amazon. So
that could be another possibility. Amazon ordered too little of my book.
Anyways, congratulations to Angela for this new book. So we are also joined by an esteemed group of discussants. So our colleague at HKU Law, Professor Sida Liu, is a renowned expert in Chinese law and society. He has been very supportive of our center's events. And right now, he's the director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. And then we have Dr. Jing Li, who is the area head and professor of management and strategy at HKU with a joint appointment in economics. We've also got Sebastian Edward, who is a partner as a prestigious law firm, Gibson, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He's now in charge of the Hong Kong office. So without further ado, let's give the floor to Angela.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Very exciting day. So as Joanne just mentioned, my second book just was released last Monday. Yeah, it was sold out on Amazon. The print version was sold on Amazon a week after its release. So I think it's because Amazon totally ordered too few of my book, so that I sold a lot, because the printing business these days are very, very tough. And I am going on an extensive book tour this time. I think I would travel to more than 45 places, doing more than 45 book talks in the coming months. But for me, the one I truly care about is today's talk, because it is with my home institution. And as you know, I've been running the Center for Chinese Law for like 5 years, and a lot of people are thinking like, why is she still here? So this is literally my second to last lecture for the Center of Chinese Law. And also because I moderated numerous talks at the center, and I never really gave any talk, So this is like truly my first talk for the center. And I feel so blessed to have the opportunity to dedicate today's book talk, actually a book talk series, because I have another one in late April, to our center, because I saw a lot of familiar faces here. A lot of my friends come to support me. So thank you, guys. Now, I have the gut feeling, being an author, that this book will sell. Okay, and obviously I'm going to sell you today for $200 a copy. And I tell you, this is the cheapest price you can ever get, because I ordered it from OUP. They gave me 50% off, and you can't get that discount anywhere else. Plus the shipping, I'm selling it at the cost. So the Asia Society is also hosting a talk for me with Morgan Stanley's chief economist. You know how much they sell? This morning I saw it's $280. So they know how to make business. While we legal scholars we just sell our knowledge. Now, why I think this book will sell? Because it touches upon a very important part of the Chinese economy, the digital sector, which contribute to more than 40% of China's GDP, okay? And regulation in China, unlike other parts of the world, have real impact, okay? So this is one of the most consequential area of Chinese law, I would have to say. And let me give you a very small example, okay? So on the Christmas Eve in 2020, just a few years ago, maybe your memory is fresh. So the State Administration for Market Regulation, which is China's market watchdog, released a one-sentence announcement on its website, very short, that it is investigating Alibaba for choose one for two monopolistic practice, okay? And 10 minutes later, the People's Daily, with China's mouthpiece, released another long commentary, strongly endorsing SAMR's investigation. I mean, obviously, this was carefully orchestrated in advance, right? I mean, this commentary was written in advance to endorse this. You know, what are the market reaction the next day? So the next day, Alibaba stock tumbled more than 13%, wiping out over $100 billion market cap from this firm. So we have a few antitrust attorneys here. Do you recall what is the ultimate fine that Alibaba received in April 2021? Sebastian, do you recall the number? That was the biggest fine ever. No, gosh, 2.8 billion US dollars. So 1 billion was the one on Qualcomm. Okay, Alibaba's fine is the biggest in Chinese antitrust history, $2.8 billion. But it's nothing compared with this, okay? This is $100 billion. And there's no sanction yet, just one single announcement. One announcement containing one single sentence, okay? So while we pay attention, we tend to fixate our attention on penalty or real legal sanctions. We tend to ignore there are so many other regulatory arsenals at the disposal of the Chinese regulators that they can use to discipline and deter platform like tech firms. And look at this market capitalization loss by Alibaba. In just a few months, this firm lost over 75% of its market cap since its peak in 2021, okay? So this used to be a company that have over $800 billion market cap, and now it's $180 billion because of what we are talking about today, okay? So this book has a lot to do with money. That's why I think it can sell. So I will start with talking about the introduction of the book, which introduced the dynamic pyramid model, which I think is very useful, not only for us to think about the tech crackdown or in general, China's tech regulation, but overall, you think about China's regulatory governance model. And then we will use China's tech crackdown as a case study because I think it's a beautiful case study to illustrate the whole life cycle of Chinese regulation. And lastly, we also talk about some sexy hot topic on AI regulation, how we applied this model to analyze the future trend of China's AI legislation. Now, if we think about Chinese regulation as a system, this system consists of three important components. We have the structure, which is very hierarchical because it's tightly coupled and very centralized. And then we have the process, which tends to be very erratic, right? I mean, very volatile, as investors know here. And then we have the outcome, which I describe as fragile because it tends to lead to a lot of unintended consequences. In other words, a lot of the measures, they tend to be well-intentioned, but in the end, they generated vast unintended consequences that actually create bigger problem than the initial problem that the regulators were supposed to address. So that leaves them in a kind of like a whack-a-mole situation, right? I mean, constantly in a crisis situation. We can use China's tech regulation as a perfect case study to illustrate this. Now, in the early days of China's, when we think about around early 2010 until 2020, right? Chinese government, particularly the top leadership, are very, very encouraging. They are very supportive of this sector. Today, these days, you heard about the AI Plus initiative. Back in the days of 2015, there is an Internet Plus initiative. Do you recall that? Okay. And these were the buzzwords that the platform used to lobby the top leadership, right? I mean, so in 2015, the State Council formally introduced the Internet Plus initiative, which is really helpful in pushing up the Chinese internet platform. So in this political hierarchy, right, the platform participants, being those merchants, users like you and me, or ride-hailing drivers, all these participants, despite the fact that they start to have problems, complaints about the platform, but regulators did very little. Why they did very little? Because in China, regulators are organized in an upward accountability system. In other words, they don't look down like their democratic counterparts in thinking about how I protect these platform participants. They look upstairs, being the top leaders, right? I mean, because the top leaders are very supportive of this sector. So what am I supposed to do, right? I'm not going to take very drastic actions in disciplining these tech firms, right? I mean, when JD.com complained about Alibaba back in 2015 for choose one for two business practice, what did they do? They go and talk to Alibaba and was like, can we have a cup of tea? Okay. And, and occasionally some local regulators will fine Alibaba for anti-unfair competition practices, which, the maximum fine is only a couple $1 million, right? I mean, for this big, large tech company, this is truly nothing. Okay, we will have time for Q&A, but, because we are short of time. Okay, so as a result, the information, despite all these tensions down there, the information transmission from the regulators to the top leaders were very slow and inefficient. And that's the inherent defect of a hierarchical political system, right? I mean, despite the fact that they can do a lot of things, but information deficit is the inherent problem in this kind of regulatory system. And then we have Jack Ma, which every one of you have heard, which is kind of like the tipping point of the whole tech regulation. And then it would start to spread like wildfire. But behind Jack Ma, there was long-standing tensions between China's People's Bank, between People's Bank of China, the PBOC, which is China's central bank and in charge of overseeing the financial sector, and Ant Group, right, which is an aspiring tech firm. It's a fintech company who want to disguise itself as a tech fin company. So they want to pitch themselves as a tech firm, so they don't have to fulfill a lot of demanding requirements as a financial holding company. And plus, they will get 4 times more, 3 times more valuation when they go on IPO. Do you know how much is the market cap of Ant when it was right before IPO? $320 billion US. This 5-year-old company that was spin off from Alibaba. Okay. Do you know what that means? It was bigger than the biggest bank in the world, JP Morgan. Its market cap was bigger than JP Morgan at the time. So if you're an official sitting in the PBOC, will you be concerned and worried about the scale of this potential systematic risk, right? So if you think about it, there are perfectly legitimate reasons for the PBOC to go after Ant, okay? But the thing is, the way they went about it, the fact that he made the speech and then really spooked the regulators. He made the speech and he really spooked the regulators because it directly challenged their legitimacy. And it was at that point, no more information asymmetry. The regulators went to President Xi, and then the top leaders decided a massive enforcement campaign that not only affected Jack Ma's business empire, but spread like wildfire, affecting every single sector permeated by the tech industry, right? The online tutoring, the ride-hailing sector, DD later was a big target, right? Everything else that you can think of. And it was also during this time, President Xi introduced this common prosperity slogan that really scared a lot of investors off, right? But it's actually a good timing for him. From his standpoint, that's a good timing for him to introduce that, because this was a good point. He was trying to cultivate mass support in empowering all these platform participants in dealing with the large platforms. Okay. But then in late 2021, Chinese economy went into a sharp slowdown, as you may recall, because of the lockdown and a lot of the geopolitical tensions. And then in early 2022, the Chinese stock experienced a massive sell-off that got the Chinese leadership very nervous. Okay, and then in March 2022, the then Vice Premier Liu He convened a meeting in which he sent a very strong signal of easing, regulatory easing in the tech sector, that the government is supportive of the tech firms, and he was signaling to the agencies that you guys, no more massive crackdown, and before you do anything, can you consult the finance department, because we don't want you to create another massive, create a lot of repercussions in the market. But despite that, the damage has been done, right? I mean, if you look at the top 10 firms market cap from its peak until, mid 2021, it wiped out over $1 trillion market cap from China's largest and most promising tech firms. And as private retreat, you saw the state advance, okay? And around that time, you see the Cyberspace Administration of China's affiliated funds started to make more golden share investment into Chinese tech firms, particularly those that own the short video apps. And these golden shares entitled is actually just 1 or 2% acquisition in those companies, but we entitle the government representative to sit on the board and veto some important corporate decisions. So that gets people very nervous. And it was also during this period of time, China adopted a series of very tough law in antitrust, in data, right? I mean, so I used to be an antitrust lawyer, but it's no longer fashionable to become an antitrust lawyer. It was data lawyer that was in huge demand in the last couple of years, right? China have the world's strictest, one of the strictest, data law adopted primarily after the GDPR, and also adopted very stringent cross-border data transfer rules that got everybody this big headache. And it was all because of, this shifting policy winds, right? I mean, so despite the fact that the crackdown has eased, it has left long-lasting institutional changes. These things don't change. These laws will be there, okay? And the people that were in power, those bureaucrats that were in power, those agencies that were in power, they will be there and will continue to be important interest group that will continue to push for strict regulation, especially when it is the right time. Now, in the book, in the introduction, I have a slightly more sophisticated diagram than the one that I just showed you, okay? So in this one, I want to particularly highlight the feedback loops between these three important components of China's regulatory system, okay? We talk about the hierarchy of the structure, regulatory structure, and that derives from resources, right? I mean, the adaptability of the leaders, because President Xi needs to balance a lot of things, and the lack of checks and balance. Look at these tech firms never, resist any of these drastic actions. And, this information deficit problem we already talked about, and that leads to a lot of volatility. And and that also tends to lead to, fragile regulatory outcome. because you don't have this resistance. Now, volatility also leads to fragility, because when the market becomes very volatile, what do investors do? They become very risk averse, okay? And that's precisely what you observe these days, right? Despite the fact that government every day, say, we want to boost your confidence, they just don't come into the market. We really need to see concrete policy support, but what is most fascinating that I found in this entire book is that fragility in turn can affect hierarchy, because that was precisely what we saw. The private has retreated, right? Because it has severely undermined investor confidence. The private sector has sold off a lot of the non-core assets, those tech firms. And the state-owned firms had marched in by acquiring strategic access or by steering the funds from, from those consumer tech business to hardcore tech business. In other words, the hierarchy has become more tightly coupled. So now we are stuck in this vicious cycle that it has become more hierarchical and more volatile and more fragile. And I think that tends to explain, I think this diagram not just explain what you see with the Chinese tech sector, the regulation in the tech sector, but also all sorts of problems you see in Chinese economy these days, right? There's a lot of policy volatility and a lot of policy resistance to the government initiatives. How do we apply this to AI? Okay. Well, we see the Chinese government has been very, very active in churning out AI regulations, right? I mean, 2021, China was the first to introduce comprehensive regulation to regulate recommendation algorithm. And a year later, China was also the first one to introduce rules to regulate deepfake. And 6 months after ChatGPT emerged, China was also the first one to crack down on those GPT-like services in apps. And China was also the first one to introduce a set of regulation to regulate generative AI services, okay? That leaves an impression that the Chinese government is very strict in demanding AI regulation. And you can understand where this is coming from, because as an authoritarian government, it is inherently insecure about information control, right? I mean, so the Cyberspace Administration of China, being the internet watchdog, has been very proactive in content moderation and going after these firms and making sure that the AI generative output is consistent with the political values of the Chinese Communist Party. But as I show you on the cover of the book, right? The government is walking on a tightrope because it constantly needs to balance competing interests. In addition to information control, the Chinese government also cares deeply about the enormous benefits that AI can potentially bring to the Chinese economy, particularly given the current economic slowdown. So we just finished our 2 sessions, the MPC, and what is the new buzzword? The new productive force, with AI being highlighted as one of them, right? I mean, this is a technology that flows like electricity, and it's expected to bring enormous benefit to the Chinese economy and upgrading the economy. So the government cares deeply about the growth of AI. And not to mention the other big elephant in the room being the Sino-US tech rivalry, where the US is now doubling down on export restrictions to China, right? It's already making it extremely hard for Chinese tech firms to source the most important critical component into training its large language models. So the last thing the government wants is to create another hurdle for its own companies to develop, the leading technology that can compete with the United States. So what do? Okay, so in the latest draft of the interim measures to regulate generative AI, which was finalized in August last year, okay, the law relies very heavily on what I call the expressive power to enable AI. So contrary to the popular perception, everybody was talking about this restricted nature of the Chinese law, how it has, CAC has churned out all this legislation trying to discipline and tighten the regulation of AI. I draw your attention to the enabling aspects of this law. because of the fact that the government needs to balance other competing interests, and particularly two important functions of the law, signaling and coordination. Okay, so a lot of you guys are lawyers here. And as lawyers, we tend to think of law as restrictive because it's trying to protect other people, trying to deter other people from violations. But here, the AI legislation have very little protective value. Instead, the main, in my opinion, the major functions of this AI legislation is to send signal to the market and the regulators and trying to coordinate the industry participants. And now let me explain briefly because we are running out of time. Okay, so signaling. How do you signal, right? I mean, how on the one hand, you need to do what you need to do. You need to maintain information control, content moderation. This is the bottom line of an authoritarian government. But on the other hand, you also want to give assurances to these Chinese AI developers and entrepreneurs and investors that the government is supportive of this industry. Okay, so how do you send a signal? When the first draft came out in April last year, it was very strict because it was promulgated by one single agency, the CAC, which does nothing but regulate, okay? And then their mission is content moderation. They don't care about the economy, okay? And it contains many impossible provisions that like really scare and spook investors. Like, okay, this is impossible to fulfill, right? I mean, you're asking me, to tweak my model within a 3-month deadlines and retrain it. That's impossible, right? I mean, so a lot of the investors were extremely nervous. So at that time, the policy signal that was sent out is that China is going to impose very strict regulations on this transformative technology. But 3 months later, when the final version came out, it was significantly diluted. All these very strict, provisions were taken off, and importantly, they significantly narrowed the scope of applications, right? I mean, so as it was written, it only applies to those firms that offer AI services to the public, and only those services that have the ability to mobilize public opinion will need to obtain a license from CAC. In other words, if you provide AI services to University of Hong Kong for your internal corporate use, or only inside the lab, you are not subject to this law, okay? So the variation during this legislative process sent a very strong signal to the industry that the government is pro-development rather than regulation. And why is that? Because in the final version, there were 6 other government departments that were involved in drafting this law. And then several of them their bureaucratic interests are tied to, fostering the development of this technology, right? Particularly the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the National Development Reform Commission. All these agencies, their bureaucratic interest is to try to enable this technology so that China can become more self-sufficient and have greater promise to win the tech race with the United States, right? So the fact that the final version has been diluted sent a strong signal that this political faction, have prevailed over the faction in favor of regulation, because a victory conveys power. Okay, and this is a much more credible signal than the pure policy itself, because this legislative process was vetted by so many interest groups from various different, different parts of China, right? I mean, from the courts, from the legislature, from the industries, right? I mean, everybody were involved. I mean, I'm sure the top leaders were also involved. So the ultimate compromise, the political compromise you see, which is in the final draft, in my opinion, sent a very strong and very credible policy signal. And I also want to draw your attention to particularly Article 5, Article 6, Article 16 in this interim measure, in which China trying to mobilize, all the platform, all the industry participants, the regulators, the industry participants, the data and computing power, standard setting, and the local legislation in order to enable this industry. Okay, so these 3 provisions were added at the, in the final version. These are the industry-friendly provisions. They kind of draw the blueprint of how China planned to enable AI. And that is perfectly consistent with the so-called 举国体制, okay, the whole of society approach the Chinese government is currently taking in order to become and stay self-sufficient, okay? So let's not, okay, so I think, let me end here because I have 3 distinguished guests here who is going to comment on the book, and I really look forward to hearing their thoughts, because each of them come from a different discipline and different perspective. I really look forward to hearing what they think about the book and the research, and also we will have plenty of time for Q&A. Thank you, guys.
So let's turn to our discussants for their valuable insights and comments on this book. Okay, so let's.
Yeah, okay. How long should my speech be?
No more than 8 minutes.
That can be a long speech. One thing I learned out of Angela's talk is before coming here, I actually always wonder who's the person sitting on the why. I can't tell actually whether it's Jack Ma or Xi Jinping. Now I think she has in mind it's probably more Xi Jinping than Jack Ma. Although I sometimes wonder why she asked me to discuss this. I think maybe part of the reason, in fact, Jack Ma now is a faculty member at Hong Kong U. He's actually in my department, so I have never seen him. So that's. But then after seeing Angela is my buddy, and then she asked, can you do this? And I don't say no to my buddy, and I said yes. But I must say that immediately after I have said yes, I regret. I regret actually for a number of reasons. For those of you, we had a lunch. I'm an economist by training, and economists have low EQs. And the economists are very harsh. We're talking about a leading economist, and I think Sebastian was asking, how do you think how good that person is? I said, competent. That's the best kind of. I can't. Which I don't worry. I don't have much to say, so kind of But anyway, so. But in fact, let me actually add one thing is one of my hero, an economist called Bob Solow. When he was actually commenting a good friend of his, Kenneth Galbraith's book, it was actually so harsh that after he wrote his book review, they didn't talk to each other for a number of years. And I don't have many kind of glamorous buddy as Angela, so I kind of worry that if I say harsh things, then maybe she will refuse to talk to me. So that can be. But fortunately, this book is very good. It's highly competent. It's more than good, in fact. Okay, let me tell you why. Okay, this is the part I want to tell you. It's kind of as trained as an economist, the most important thing in thinking about how to do the analysis, the first thing first is to figure out who the players are. I have a few students down there. They have heard me say that a number of times. You think it's easy, it's actually not easy at all. Let me actually say one more joke and I start to do the real thing. The joke actually coming out of Paul Krugman, who has a book called Peddling Prosperity. And at the beginning of the book, he was, I think, quoting an Indian economist at MIT and says the following. He says, if you are a virtuous economist, Indian economist, next life, you become a physicist. If you're an evil economist, next life, you become a sociologist. Any sociologist here? I don't know, but all right. What Krugman actually means is just relative to physicist job, sociologist, so much harder. You're navigating an entire system, figuring out what's the top priority. That is actually difficult. I think the type of system Angela's book is looking at is very complicated. And out of that, you look at a framework. So I'm still going to say a bit of a bad thing about the book. I don't like the named dynamic pyramid, because pyramid is not dynamic. But other than that, I think it's fantastic. It has leaders on the top, regulators, platform, and players on there. And the most important to emphasize that, and it seems very easy, is the emphasis on the top leaders. This is the defining characteristic of the Chinese system that's different from the US system and from the European system. Once that top leader has been brought into the picture, everything else actually flows very naturally. You look at the book, it is actually, you read the first chapter, it's not an easy kind of almost engineering type of figure, but once you get that, everything actually works really well. But let me actually emphasize the top leader a little bit more, right? Because what I think that's special, unique about your framework. Once the attention is on the top leader, I think you talked a lot about the top leader is attention constraint. There's so much information, they're going to regulate only when things that are up to attention. And as a result, you get a lot of volatility, you get agility. I'll say. Let me emphasize two more things about the top leader. One is that we as an economist will talk about, okay, the first question is, here's the player, and then what is the player's objective? That we always have to ask. So I think this is another part in the Chinese setting will be a little bit different from the US and the Europe setting, where the top leader's objective is probably a little bit more than the narrowly defined consumer surplus or consumer welfare. An important part of it is safety for the leaders. I have another discussion in the past. I always write down the objective function of the emperor. The emperor's objective function is survival, plus maybe the survival of the kids. Similar thing here. As a result, what you're going to see is that one of the concerns they have, it's actually everywhere, but particularly in China, they cannot have platform to be as powerful as they are. Once you have the top, you're going to see, I think we had this piece together where Alibaba has to break it up to 6 pieces, basically. So one of the things in the objective is that then it's not just consumer welfare, but making sure these companies cannot be a serious threat to the top. I think that's one of the things implicitly alluded in your book. I want to emphasize it a bit more. And the side consequences of this is that the regulatory agency is not going to be very strong. So we're going to be at a power structure where the top is strong, but has limited attention. And then everyone else down there is, even if they can be powerful, that can not be a long-run steady state. So that's one point. Maybe Andrew was one more point.
Yeah, I was
well, one more point. Once I start talking, I have lots of points, but now I only have one more point. So you have I talk about attention, I talk about objective function of the leader. Maybe add just one last point, which is the comprehension of the leader. We as an economist tend to think without the principal agent model, the leader is smart. In reality, leader has comprehension constraints. Or to put it harshly, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Okay, you start out with this example, and this is on I guess it's kind of Alibaba was punished in part because they have this kind of exclusionary practice. You have choose one out of the two, this type of practice. And you look at it narrowly speaking, it is a bad thing. Apparently it's a bad thing, but I will not bore you with the logic, but one of the paper I'm currently writing is that, maybe give you an example to think about it. You think about your Hong Kong food delivery market. There's Deliveroo, there's Food Panda, and then there is the new Kita, right? You ask the question is, in the long run, is there only one player going to survive, or 2 players going to survive, or 3? And the way economists think about this is also, you look at demand, you look at the supply. On the supply side, cost side, is there economy of scale? If there's economy of scale, more likely only one player. Then more importantly, you also care about the demand side, which is, do consumers care about variety? Okay? If consumers don't care about variety, and then there's economy of scale, you're going to only have one player. Okay? But in this industry, I bet many of you actually have both Food Panda, and Deliveroo. Maybe you also have Kita, you have three. And for me, what's the reason I have three? It's because some of these platforms has exclusionary deal with certain restaurant. The only reason I have Deliveroo is because one of my favorite Hainan chicken restaurant is on Deliveroo. Okay? But then you think about it. If you ban this exclusionary, all of these platforms might become very homogeneous. And once they have homogeneous products and there's economy of scale, in the long run, you might only have one company, one platform. Is this what you want? So this is what I meant is when the decision is go to the very top, who's not necessarily an expert, comprehension constraint may lead them to do things that sounds right in the long run, in the short run, but very damaging in the long run. So let me finish. Yeah.
Okay, my turn. First of all, I want to congratulate my friend and colleague Angela for publishing this excellent book, which I had the privilege to read actually last summer when it was still a manuscript. When it was not didn't have a pretty cover like this, but it's actually a Word document, very messy Word document. Of course, I had that privilege not because I had any expertise on the book. After all, I'm a sociologist of law. What do I know about big tech, right? So I had that privilege only because I've known Angela for more than 20 years, because we actually went to the same law school at Beida, around the same time. And of course, now we're colleagues here at Hong Kong U. But more than that, Angela and I also both did our doctoral degrees at University of Chicago, right? So also around the same time. So I think what I would do today is to give Angela a Chicago-style comment to show my respect and appreciation for the book. For those of you who know, that means I'll save all the praises and try to tear the book apart. So that's what I'm trying to do in 8 minutes or less. As you can see, I actually totally agree with Professor Li. I think the concept of a dynamic pyramid model is actually quite strange and misleading. Right, and if you look at the three components of the dynamic pyramid model, is hierarchy, volatility, and fragility. Right. So what I will do is I'll talk about the opposite of these three concepts: fragmentation, stability, and durability, and how that relates to big tech. Right. First of all, fragmentation. I think if you read the book, and also I think Professor Li's comments, focus a lot more on the top of the pyramid, which is the leadership, and also the bureaucracy under the leadership. And to be fair, Angela did actually discuss the fragmented nature of the Chinese bureaucracies under the leadership, which I think is a very important part of the what I call fragmentation, which is an important characteristic of the structure. But I think that another very important part, which is more related to the platform economy, because if you think about it, I mean, this dynamic pyramid model can be applied to any areas of Chinese regulation, right? Which is a great strength of the model. But what's so special? What is so unique about platforms, about these big tech? I think it says, to me, the most important characteristic of these platforms, especially in the Chinese context, it has a great leveling effect. In other words, it makes our world more flat, rather than more hierarchical. Why? Because if you think about Taobao, all these small shops on Taobao, they can reach millions of customers now, and which they couldn't possibly reach before the platforms came into being. If you think about all the restaurant options you have for delivery, like Professor Li just talked about. If you think about all the TV shows, all the entertainment, all the sports available to you, right? It has a great leveling effect, I think, in Chinese society more generally. So how does that much more leveled and fragmented structure build into the regulatory system? And in other words, if you look at the four parts of the pyramid, at the very bottom are the platform participants. I think the importance and the influence of the participants, ordinary people like all of us, on the whole story of Chinese tech regulation is overlooked in this dynamic pyramid model because it's focusing more on the top rather than the bottom. So that's the fragmentation part. The stability part, why I find the concept of volatility unsatisfactory. I wouldn't say problematic, unsatisfactory is because, Angela is absolutely right, actually. Yes, it's very volatile. Look at the whole history of tech regulation. First of all, they allow everything is kind of a, laissez-faire, kind of a lax, regulation. You can pretty much do whatever you want. And then all of a sudden they tighten up the regulation, even have some kind of crackdown on the big tech. And then, once they realize, there's overreach, the government started to relax the policy again, right? It sounds like very volatile, right? But if you look, if you zoom out, look at other sectors of the Chinese economy and Chinese governance, you find this is actually a very stable pattern. For example, if you think about how China regulates social media, how China regulate newspapers, how China regulate NGOs, how China regulate the legal profession, which I study, you see exactly the same pattern. Whenever something new is being developed, first of all, there's open field, right? A very loose regulation, and the government is basically watching to see what's happening. Just like to try to raise a pig, right? So they want the pig to get bigger and fatter, and then once it gets too big, too fat, one is getting out of shape, then all of a sudden they start to kill the pig, right? So it's a very, some of you are laughing, it's a very familiar story, right? So there's nothing volatile, it's a highly stable and predictable way of thinking about Chinese governance. So that's the second part I want to. So it's not just volatility, also stability. The third part, Andrew talked about fragility. It looks like this is a very fragile system of governance. But I also want to emphasize this is also highly durable. Why? Because again, if you zoom out, not just look at this particular tech regulation in the past 3 to 5 years, you realize market hates uncertainty, right? Market hate uncertainty. Like people want more clarification as much as possible. That's why whenever the Fed, Mr. Powell tried to make a speech, that the stock market react, right? But I think in the context of China, it's very important to appreciate that the Chinese government is actually keeping things uncertain on purpose. It's to their advantage. That's actually a very important feature of Chinese governance. They do not want everything clarified, everything predictable, because that's actually not, you will loosen their control. You will actually make them less powerful. I think the regulators are, the Chinese regulators feel like they're a lot more powerful when they keep a fairly large amount of uncertainty. And that, of course, is often annoying, vexing for the market players. But that's the important nature of Chinese governance, right? So I hope by now I used probably less than 8 minutes I hope I've done my job and tore the book apart. So the last thing I want to say is that I do agree with Angela on one point. This book will definitely sell. Why? Because it's not just about money. It's not just about big tech. Because if you're a political scientist trying to learn about Chinese governance, or if you're a sociologist trying to learn about Chinese society relations, or you're just a ordinary person trying to learn more about China, I think this book has a lot more to offer, right? So I believe this book will sell on Amazon again and again and again. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
So which part of Sida's remarks you need to pay attention to. It's the last part is truly important. And then, Sebastian, you know why you're the last one to speak. You now play a very important role in propping me up. You understand?
Well, I was actually asking myself why 3 university professors would ask a humble practicing lawyer, to speak on their panel. And I guess it's because they just don't want anybody to outshine them. And so it's better to have someone who's not a university professor, because they know that, they will not speak as intelligently as they were. I'm very honored to be here, but I must say I have very mixed feelings about this event. I've known Angela for 10 years. She was 16 at the time, I think. She asked me to say that. We were speaking together at a conference in St. Gallen in Switzerland. And I've been a big fan ever since. And I've been a big fan because I think Angela is the most interesting scholar in the China anti-monopoly field. I'm not going to say the most exciting scholar, because I don't think you can put the word exciting and antitrust in the same sentence, but she definitely is the most interesting. And the reason is that most of us who consider themselves as experts in this field, and I sort of will include myself, we all write very, very superficially about what's happening in the mainland in this field. We say, we write articles and we say, oh, summer this and MOFCOM that, just describing what's happening. We say it remains to be seen because we have no idea what the regulation means. And more importantly, we always censor ourselves because we don't want to offend the regulator. So what we write, I mean, we experts, quote unquote, is very bland, is very superficial. But Angela is not like that. That's why she's the most interesting, because Angela has access to sources to which we don't have access. And that's why she can explain what's happening behind the scenes. I mean, you should read, if you have, I mean, I'm sure you've all read it, the article about the Great Reversal, or her first book. She really explained things that we, superficial experts, we don't have access to. And she's capable of putting things in perspective because she knows the facts, she knows the institution. So it's what she's saying is much more interesting. She also takes the time to think, but that's just probably because she's a scholar, so she has time to think. But it's a big advantage over the superficial experts. And then, very importantly, she's not afraid to offend. She's written things in The Great Reversal and in the first book that I would have never written myself, or I would have been overruled by my senior partner at the time. And that's, that combination is why I think she's greatly admired in the antitrust community in China. And so I was a bit upset when she sort of started to branch out and, study data and AI. And I mean, she once called me to say, hey, I'm not teaching on data. I was like, why? I mean, we need you in the antitrust field. So yes, data is interesting, but sort of stay with us. Antitrust is globally at a crossroad. There's very interesting debates about what antitrust should be doing. What do we do with platforms? Do we need to move to a sector regulation like the DMA? And so on. And these questions also have to be addressed in the Chinese context. And there's nobody better placed intellectually to address these questions than Angela. And so I was saying that I have mixed feelings because obviously I'm very happy. I mean, I'm thrilled about the book. I mean, I started reading it. It's very exciting, and I'll probably read it to my kids as well. And I think the book is indispensable. It's not only for lawyers, it's actually for business people as well, and it's for diplomats and politicians. But I have mixed feelings because I'm very, very sad that Angela is leaving Hong Kong to teach in California because we need you here, Angela. We need you to understand and to make sense of what's happening in the mainland. And I'm very afraid that because you're so smart and eclectic and intelligent and I'm going to flatter your ego, but I'm actually afraid that you're going to start writing about US law. And that would be such a loss for us. I'm sure you'll say I'll come back from time to time, but it's not the same. We really, really, really will miss you. I mean, I'll miss you as a friend, but I think the community will miss you as a scholar because there's nobody like you, and I really mean it. And if you allow me to say something politically incorrect, I find it really sad that Hong Kong is not sort of capable of keeping first-class talent like Angela. I mean, we have everything here. We have great beaches. We have the hiking is fantastic. The food is great. The taxes are great. It seems that there's two things we cannot keep or get. One is Taylor Swift, and the second is Angela.
So let's open to questions from the audience. So any questions?
Yeah, and she's coming. Yes. So this is a professor from the political science department who specializes in anti-corruption. Professor Zhu Jiangnan, please.
Thank you, Angela. I'm Jiangnan from the politics department. I'm asking this question in response to Sla's core political scientist. So I truly enjoyed this book talk. It's probably the best book talk that I've been to at HKU. No exaggeration. Yeah, so really enjoyed the presentation and the discussions. So my question is, so when we talk about this political economy in China, especially for private enterprises, oftentimes we'll have to think about the personal the connections between the enterprises and the political elites. So I'm pretty sure you know what I'm talking about
Yes.
for Alibaba,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I wonder to what extent this is taken into consideration in your theory and your book.
Yeah. In my book, I talk about how firms lobby. So in my model, there are 4 major players. And when we outsiders look at Chinese regulation, we tend to look at the top policymakers and the regulators because these are the more prominent and visible actors. We tend to overlook the firms, which are actually very active players behind the scenes. And in China, because of the way the political economy is structured, firms don't tend to lobby, in front, right? When you do see, Pony Ma and Jack Ma attending the 2 sessions, all the political consultant conferences, right? All these political events. Jack Ma is also a party member. So these are the formal institutional route that they use to lobby, but they rely more heavily on informal institutional route, which I elaborated in the book, right? So they rely on information brokers, people like me. I think he mentioned that earlier, Sebastian, like I know things he don't know because our promiscuity to the regulators. And so we become information intermediaries, but I don't have as good sources as my peers in the mainland, I have to admit. Now, the other thing is what Jiangnan mentioned, she studied corruption, is the crony capitalisms, right? Almost, if you run a large business, you will want, right, the princeland to invest in your farms because you align your interests with the political elites. You will want to stay on farms or stay back fund to invest in your farms, and that it can help you to lobby internally within the government. So the informal institutions play a very important role in shaping Chinese regulatory process. We tend to be overlooked. Right? Why do you think all these laws were watered down? Right? There is a lot of forces, lobbying forces behind, an army of people working very aggressively behind the scenes. So I think what the book does is to unravel and all this intricate nature of the firms lobbying behind the scenes. Yeah.
So actually, I'm a physicist. So I'm a professor from a physics department. Yeah. Actually, I'm teaching AI in physics, and my research is about fundamental quantum physics. So I'm very interested in your talk and also these discussions. My question is that actually very simple. That how do you see under this Chinese style of government and Chinese style of regulation, are the AI industry of China, let's say, will eventually win or lose? Where is the future? Are we going to win over the US, or actually the industry will go down? And more fundamentally, in terms of, let's say, research and technology, for my business, for my activity, I think that is 举国体制 is actually not good.
Yeah.
It's not inherently is against the human creative nature, put it that way. So I'm asking you, where is the future, in terms of this AI or economy in China? What do you think?
Yeah. I look, with AI, a few years ago, so Eric Schmidt from Google and Grant Allison from Harvard, they published a quite influential report that basically cautioning that, look, China is catching up. China is going to win AI supremacy over the United States. Look at how they did with the facial recognition technology. China is now the #1 in terms of research, AI capability. China is also the #1. So we are lagging behind, But when ChatGPT emerged, the whole Chinese state just woke up and they're like, look, we are behind. And now with the export restrictions on NVIDIA chips, I mean, the gap is widening, right? I mean, during the 2 sessions, everybody was talking about Sora. I mean, why we don't have Sora when they have Sora? And then it seems it's more and more difficult for the Chinese AI industry to catch up, right? I mean, but with AI, I'm slightly more optimistic in the sense that this is a field that the entry barrier is not as high as, you know, semiconductor, right? I mean, it involves a less complex supply chain. So the main bottleneck that we have is the computing power. Now, I'm a lawyer, right? I understand these sanctions are slowing down Chinese top firms, and it's hard for them to get NVIDIA chips these days. But, you know, law is never complete, right? I mean, in any law, there is holes, right? I mean, so, and we have a student who studies sanctions, right? You would tell you sanction tends to fail because there are ways for our smart lawyers and you know, entrepreneurs to get around these things, right? I mean, so as long as Chinese firms eventually figure out a way to get sufficient computing power, I'm sure that the AI industry can catch up fairly quickly. I mean, but to the extent that they succeed, they don't want to reveal the capability to the U.S. immediately, right? I mean, they will be subject to the sanctions and so a lot of the investigations, right? So I'm more hopeful about the AI industry given the talents that we have, the capital that we have. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I got the microphone first. Should I go?
You go first.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Angela. My question is, during the 2 sessions that just ended last week, you mentioned that the government is actually putting a lot of emphasis on AI development, but also on the other hand, I think during the sessions, there were also equally a lot of emphasis on security. So I think on one hand, the government wants to ensure security. On the other hand, they also want to push forward the AI development of the tech space in China. I just want to hear your perspective on how do these two go hand in hand, or you think the government is using AI as a tool to strengthen security?
Excellent question. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I've been working in a couple of the tech companies that you mentioned, including Alibaba and also, so I've been seeing the rise and fall over the past decade. And also I'm a Hong Kong U alumni.
Excellent. Did what I say make sense to you, by the way? You are the insider.
So hearing from a legal perspective would be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I have one sentence response to what you said. So I have a good friend, Professor Zhang, working from China's political science university, and then she's a leading advisor on China's AI policy. And she wrote an article that says the non-development of AI is the biggest threat to our national security. So you know what that stands, right? I mean, so the faction in favor of AI development nowadays clearly prevail over those that pro strict regulations. And in fact, you know, if we don't develop, that will be perceived as the biggest threat to our national security. Yeah.
Yeah, sentence to it. So I actually thought, borrow this. No, actually I borrowed this. The cover of this book is an answer to your question. Because on the one hand, AI create value. On the other hand, the person who has the AI technology potentially enabling threats to the power. So that's why it's a high wire.
Yeah, excellent.
Oh, thank you. I'm Ziqi. I'm also an antitrust lawyer, and I'm a big fan of Angela as well. I read your first book, and I just ordered your second book, but haven't had a chance to read it. So my question relates to a point that Professor Liu also mentioned about the fragmentation within the Chinese government. My question is, do you think the fragmentation within the Chinese government has changed to some extent during the past few years, and how do you think that would affect the tech and antitrust regulation in China?
For me?
Yeah, maybe both of you, because I know that you talked about.
Well, given the time constraint.
Yeah, of course, Angela. Yeah.
Well, as you know, in 2018, China's 3 antitrust agencies have consolidated, right? I mean, so to some extent, that alleviate a little bit of the fragmentation problem. But however, they are still embedded in the bigger bureaucratic, setting where there's other agencies like MIT, and that Ministry of Commerce are eyeing on their turf. including NDRC, right? I mean, so the power of fermentation is a perennial theme in China's bureaucratic rivalry. So that in itself hasn't changed much. But you also observe since the regulatory easing in early 2022, your practice has become very quiet. Did you notice that? Yeah, because I think that is the thing, because the antitrust practice in enforcement is, adjusting to the shifting of the policy winds from the above, right? I mean, because of the easing now, we don't see as many, we hardly see any activity these days from the antitrust regulator. Big action from the regulator. Yeah, these days. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're running out of time. Can we give one more question? Well, I'm happy to say. And by the way, because this class, we have a class at 2:30 here, and so we will be moving up to one floor up, 901. For the book signing and whatever you want to check with me, I'm here the whole afternoon. Yeah. So yeah. So last question, and then we finish. I think this lady really wants it.
Thank you, Professor. There is Zoe. I'm going further with my PhD degree in Jinan University, in Guangdong, and now I'm a research associate in Faculty of Law, HKU. So my research interest is focused on merger control, is competition law. So I want to ask Angela, if especially for big tech company, especially for platforms, if they wanna go to the United States or some European countries where had a serious regulation for merger control or antitrust law, especially for Chinese companies, how should those kind of the companies do to deal with the antitrust investigations?
Right. I mean, that's an excellent question. That's actually the question for my first book.
Yeah.
In the first book, Chinese antitrust exceptionalism, one part I deal with how China regulates its companies and also foreign companies in China. But then the second part talks about how Chinese firms adapt to the antitrust rules in Europe and the United States. And you're absolutely right. Right? I mean, say with China's AI regulation or antitrust regulation now is very lax, right? I mean, particularly AI is very lax. But when the Chinese firms go overseas, they need to adapt this, to the local rules, right? I mean, just like what ByteDance does, right? I mean, TikTok faced a ban in the United States. So their competitive advantage here locally, where they enjoy this very friendly business environment, that advantage is diminished when they go overseas because they need to play by the local rules. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And in fact, the Chinese identity will play against them, as you see in the TikTok example.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You say thank you. Say thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. And Angela has ordered some books at discount from Oxford University Press. So for those who are interested in buying Angela's book, it is 200 Hong Kong dollars today. It is a special discount Angela got for this event. And please follow our center's social media and website. We have a lot of things going on. And thank you all for coming. Yeah.